Hey everybody, it's Cold War, week 3. So this week I decided to make this video to make some of these topics a little easier to understand because there's a lot of information going on in this section. So this is a map of Europe during this Cold War era. And you've seen this map in other slideshows, but you just have to notice how large the Soviet Union is and how much land they'd taken over. We have East Germany here, and we talked about the splitting of Germany last section. And you can see that Western Europe obviously is feeling threatened by the Soviet Union and all of their arms. One other thing that we need to be noticing too is Turkey. This is going to come into play later in this section, how close it is to the Soviet Union and their land holdings. So keep that in mind. Turkey right there. All right, so the arms race is going to start in 1949. Realistically, it started right after World War II, but the Soviet Union is going to set up their first atomic weapon in 1949, signaling to the United States that they also had atomic weapons. So by the mid 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had ICBMs, which are these really long range, not super long range, um, atomic missiles. I mean, they're not shooting from the United States all the way to the Soviet Union, but they could definitely go from, say, Cuba to the United States or Turkey to the Soviet Union. So that was really threatening because now they'd be able to be shot a further distance to actually explore some of these nuclear arms that were developed. You can hit this link and check out the different nukes of the time period and some that have been developed nowadays and what their detonation capabilities would be. And this is obviously Stalin just being there. So in the United States, in order to prepare ourselves, air quotes, for the potential of a Soviet nuclear weapon, we practiced duck and cover. If you are curious about the wonderful cartoon that was produced by the government, you can click this link. And really what the program was is to try to get students to act like Bert the Turtle and to hide from the nuclear arm. And that meant go under the desk. The cartoon, the ad here, it's not really a cartoon fully, has kids like ducking under their desks, slamming themselves against lockers, jumping off bikes and leaning against walls, but it really was to just make people feel more prepared, just like our fire drills or lockdown drills. It's just a mental preparation. If you're curious about some pictures of this era, fallout shelters and other things, you can click this link here. As you guys know, the Yell once housed a fallout shelter that was supposed to be for important people living in the town. Um, I don't know what's going on there now. Hopefully, they removed all of the canned food. The space race was also set off during this time period because people were so worried that the first people to space would be able to drop nukes from outer space. So the space race is set off about controlling the skies, controlling the satellites as well. So the Soviet Union was the first to get out into outer space in October of 1957. The United States followed up, President Eisenhower signing in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1958, which led to the Mercury program first, which utilized Air Force pilots, and then the Apollo missions that were later. So the Apollo mission is 11 is the one that landed on the moon, and there were 6 more Apollo missions, and it ended in 1972. We still send astronauts to outer space, but the quests are different now. All right, let's get into some of this here. The Bay of Pigs. So we've been talking a little bit about nuclear arms, and one of the things that people were most stressed about was Cuba, which was underneath they were having like social and economic changes that were occurring on their island. And Fidel Castro, who was a socialist turned communist, was rising up in Cuba, which was of great concern to the United States because we were very worried about having a communist sympathizing nation so close to the border of the United States. Also, too, throughout their revolution, a lot of people had left Cuba and had fled to Miami. Conditions in Cuba had deteriorated, and a once ally of the United States, going back in history, we had, as the United States, helped aid Cuba to remove the Spanish at the turn of the century. And Cuba had once been a territory of the United States. So Cuba was a strong ally that we had helped grow into this democratic society, but that did not last. So um, when Fidel Castro overthrew Batista, the Soviet Union was really supporting Castro in the implementation of his new regime because they saw, like I said, an ally that would threaten the United States. The United States organized this invasion where 1,400 exiles from Cuba were going to go into Cuba and then infiltrate government forces by saying that they were leaving the United States and that they were going to basically be moles in the Cuban government for the USA. And then they were going to start getting more people on their side, talking to Cubans who are unhappy with Castro, and then have this internal uprising. But the invasion was very flawed. What they did is they launched these airships from ships and planes from the United States, and they were supposed to be these military war vessels that were going to be destroying the Cuban Air Force. So the Cubans did not have any eyes on what was going on. And what ended up occurring was they didn't destroy all of the airplanes. Also, too, the Bay of Pigs invasion was intended for a different location. And what ended up going down is Kennedy was given the option to pick the Bay of Pigs, which is the circle location here. And then they had given him some alternate places. However, they didn't describe exactly why the Bay of Pigs probably was not the most ideal location. And then there was a lot of heat put on Kennedy after the fact because they said that he was the one who had selected it, whereas the CIA had come back through their declassification documents and been shown to be the ones that kind of shouldn't have had that location on the map to begin with. It's surrounded by jungle. It was a vacation spot that Castro himself had frequented. Well, either way, it led to a giant failure. And then Kennedy takes responsibility for the disaster. But again, it cut ties between Cuba and the United States, pushing Fidel Castro closer to the Union. So during this time too, just one other thing that's going on is in Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, and it is residing in East Germany. They actually constructed a physical wall to separate East and West Berlin. So they started building this in 1961 under Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union during this time period. A lot of people who are living in East Berlin tried to flee to West Berlin. Reminder, East Berlin is under control of the Soviet Union, whereas West Berlin is under control of Western powers. So what they were really doing is circling West Berlin. So there's a clip here from Bridge of Spies about that. What ends up happening is the conditions in East Berlin were really bad. They were deteriorating rapidly with the Soviet Union in control. And people wanted to be in the West because things were more prosperous there. And the West ends up being entirely cut off from the supply chain, and they actually end up having to drop crates of food and other supplies into West Berlin. So that we'll talk about later. So this is the Butter Battle Book, and again, you can skip this if you'd like. It's just a interest piece about the Cold War, and Dr. Seuss actually writes some things about the Cold War because obviously he wrote or cartooned different pieces in criticism of the war anyway, so it's just fitting that he's going to also write some other children's books about understanding what's going on. So the Butter Battle book, if you ever read it, low-key about the Cold War. All right, let's get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, in 1962, Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union began planting nuclear missiles in Cuba to counteract the American missiles in Turkey. So remember Turkey. So the United States had been a long ally of Turkey and had been housing nuclear arms in Turkey. And obviously, Khrushchev and Soviet Union is going to feel the immediate threat of the nuclear missiles on their border. So when Cuba becomes a ally of the Soviet Union, the first thing Khrushchev wants to do is to build silos to house nuclear arms. The United States is alerted of this. They can fly over and capture images of the Cubans starting to build these fortifications for nuclear arms. So what ends up going on is Kennedy is, brought this information, and it's like, what are we going to do? Because now the Soviets are going to be on our back door with nuclear weapons, and we can't trust them. So Kennedy sets up this blockade, which is a line of naval ships and warships here to stop the Soviet Union from delivering the missiles. So we can't get the missiles from Soviet Union into Cuba if they have to go through this blockade. And there's a lot of conversation back and forth between Khrushchev and Kennedy about what's going on. And what ends up happening is they meet on this war ship in the middle of the ocean and discuss how to bring an end to this tense situation. And it ended up in a peaceful negotiation. So at the end of this, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to reduce their nuclear arms, knowing that the massive destruction and nuclear war that could be set off if lighter heads do not prevail. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest that the world has come to this nuclear war. In 1992, it was revealed by high-ranking Soviet officer that the missiles would have been used against the United States if the United States had tried to send troops to invade Cuba. So these missiles weren't just for idle threat. These missiles were intended for use. So crisis averted. And just quickly, who is Nikita Khrushchev? There he is. He was the leader of the Communist Party after Stalin, and he was best known for that negotiation with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He actually tried to reduce a lot of the things that Stalin had done because he thought that Stalin had ruled again with that iron fist, and he was trying to bring a more diplomatic role into the Soviet government. He also wanted to improve the standard of living for a lot of the people that were living in those Soviet bloc countries because he was very fearful that revolution would arise if he did not give Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany some basic standard of living. Because of that, though, he's not forcing as many people to work in labor camps and things like that. Their industrial growth rate is going to decline. He was removed from office because a lot of the Soviet people did not feel that the Cuban Missile Crisis was handled appropriately. This is Khrushchev here with Fidel Castro. And here is Khrushchev with Kennedy. Well, I guess that's it, guys. Sorry I have to listen to my son in the background, but audio notes hopefully got you through it a little easier. Have a great day.